Hi, my name's Ryan Anderson from Google, and you're listening to another episode of the Digital Native Podcast. Today's guest, we have Dan Sullivan. Dan is the author of the official Google Cloud Study Guide for the professional architect, professional data engineer, and the associate cloud engineer. Dan, thanks for joining.
Hey, Ryan. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So as a way to get us started, Dan, would love to hear more about kind of your background, both in technology and your involvement with Google Cloud.
Sure. Well, let's see. I started Google Cloud. It was probably about, maybe 5-6 years ago. I was working at a genetics research institute at Virginia Tech, and I was working on my dissertation, and I worked on text mining in biomedical literature, and I had been using another cloud, and I had found myself doing a lot of things sort of unrelated to my research work, like configuring firewall rules, debugging issues around networking and things like that, and I got kind of frustrated about it when really, all I wanted to do was like set up a Spark cluster and run some jobs kind of thing. And that's when I sort of dipped my toes into the Google Cloud waters, and I was hooked. I mean, it was so much easier. Just, of course, the networking was much easier, but I found the quality of the services was better than I had experienced before. I had fewer bugs that I was wrestling with or configuration problems. Things just seemed to work. And yeah, so that's how I kind of got into it, and I've sort of not gone back.
No, that's great. And you're based here in Portland. How did you end up in Portland? Yeah. And then what kinds of companies have you worked for here locally?
Let's see. Well, how we got here was kind of interesting. My wife is a poet, and when we were in Virginia, she was spending a lot of time on the road, going to other places like New York City, where and we just decided we wanted to move to a place that had more of a poetry scene. And so a couple of spots came up. One was Amherst, Massachusetts, and my wife and I are both from Massachusetts, so we wanted to go somewhere different. And the other top candidate was Portland, and we spent one weekend here, and we were hooked. I mean, we knew right away that was a good spot for us. So we've been here about 8 years now, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So not the focus, obviously, of the conversation, but what is the poetry scene like here in Portland?
Well, it's interesting. It's pretty active. When we first got here, it was pretty active in terms of like readings, probably 2 or 3 times a week. My wife and I would go out, or she would be out in readings. There's definitely a lot of poets here, a lot of written poetry, and my wife has a poetry press. Well, it's a literary press, but concentrates mostly on poetry here in Portland, called Yes Yes Books. And there are a couple other presses here in Portland, but yeah, no, it's pretty active.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So, you obviously have some experience, and now you're, writing some of these study guides for Google Cloud. But I think your journey, one, coming from a different cloud and, being really an early adopter, getting involved in the early days, is interesting. Can you take me through kind of that journey, your thought process going in, maybe some areas you were skeptical, and some findings that you found, early when you first started messing around with Google Cloud?
Sure. I think I think the first thing I noticed was I had to kind of orient my sort of mental model about working in the cloud, because for example, GCP, it's very, you work with projects, you have organizations and folders and projects, and you have the resource hierarchy, and that's a different model from what I had experience with like in AWS. So part of it was just reframing. And so once I kind of got over that, then it was like everything kind of clicked. Like, Compute Engine really parallels like EC2. So the model of switching and working with virtual machines or clusters, it's all pretty much the same. It was a pretty easy switch. Some things, of course, are obviously different, like identity and access management is very specific in GCP. But it didn't take a long time to get kind of up to speed on that. So I would say the period of getting started was pretty short, actually. Again, because things just kind of work. I think Google tends to have very long beta cycles where they'll release a product, and by the time it goes to GA, to general release, it's pretty bulletproof. So I think that's another thing that I found. I didn't have a lot of surprises. Like I had some surprises, like working with Spark clusters and EMR. When I worked with healthcare data, which was subject to HIPAA regulations. And so there were some things that we had to sort of do with regards to like encryption between nodes when I was working with Spark clusters on AWS. I just, I don't have to worry about that kind of thing when I was in GCP. So,
and you spoke to something interesting. A question that I get a lot is, hey, I have, a team of really, fully trained AWS engineers, developers. What is the ramp time for them to get to know Google?
Yeah.
What have you seen in the market?
That's a really good question. I'd say it can vary. I'd say there's always that initial adjustment to the Google model. But after that, I'd say it's fairly straightforward. It's pretty easy if you're almost doing like a mental lift and shift and you're setting up VMs and load balance clusters, then it's pretty straightforward. But really, some of the big advantages in Google come from using some of the specialized services like BigQuery, going serverless, or if you're using, if you have like a large IoT application and you want to start using Bigtable, Cloud Data Flow is another tool. Like if you're using Flink over in AWS and then you're moving over, it's going to be pretty straightforward because they both are based on they implement Apache Beam. So I would say it could be very quick if you're just doing sort of basic VM level work and you're running a bunch of jobs on Linux or Linux clusters, then it's pretty straightforward. But if you really want to exploit the real benefits and go serverless in GCP, then you're going to have definitely a longer ramp up time.
Okay.
Maybe a month, 2 months.
No, that's great. Appreciate the insight. So shifting the conversation a little bit, and I think we'll get back to some of the technology. Difficult time for many businesses right now. Some folks in my community, in my circle, both engineers, sales, different roles, are in a spot where they're looking for a new job. What advice do you have, for an engineer right now who's recently unemployed, who's potentially looking for their next role?
Well, I would say, from my own experience, I would say something that engineers, maybe as a group, we don't think enough about is soft skills. So things like being able to collaborate on teams, writing, and I'm not talking about like writing books or articles, but just like being able to document things that you can share in like a collaborative way, especially now that a lot of us, many of us are working remotely. A lot of times we're going to work asynchronously. So where you might have been able to just, had a chat with somebody down the desk or, across from your desk. Now we don't as easily like pick up the phone and have a hangout. I mean, we might do that, but also there's more asynchronous communication. So definitely soft skills is something I see, like when I do interviews, people might be really good with their technical skill set, but they won't maybe get too far in the interview process if they don't have the soft skills, because so much of what we do now in IT and just tech in general is team-based. Because any one of us could be really good at one thing or two things, but really it takes teams to build really kind of the complex systems that we're dealing with today. So I would say definitely work on, like pay attention to soft skills. And if you don't even know what they are, that's okay. I mean, there's like on Coursera, there'll be courses like literally about collaboration and communication on teams. Definitely worth watching those kind of things.
It's great advice. I'm an analogy guy, and yeah, any time I can see someone with those kind of communication skills take something very complex and make it very simple or put it in someone else's language or terms, I'm blown away.
Yeah.
And, like anything, that's a skill, something that you get better and better at.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. And of course, I would say the other thing is just, we always have to be constantly learning. The technology is constantly changing. Better tools are coming out. So just being in the habit of learning is another important thing for us to keep in mind.
Yeah. Good advice. Any tips or anything outside the box for companies as they're shifting to a more remote environment and working remotely?
Yeah, I would say this is if you haven't adopted agile practices, this is a good time. Things like stand-ups, like just getting people together for 15 minutes in the morning. What did I get done yesterday? What do I plan on working on today? That can go a long way to helping people keep in sync when they're working remotely. If you're not used to doing meetings with, say, people, some of the people in a conference room, some people on a Hangout, some good practices I find are just things like have somebody take notes in the meeting and share the screen and have that up on the screen, because sometimes, people might not follow along. It's very easy to get distracted if, my dog is barking or whatever. So it's great to have like that visual record and things I can focus on.
Yeah, and so many of us are visual.
Yep, exactly.
So beyond the pandemic, I mean, just kind of looking at the landscape of startups, companies that are I guess building new applications and moving more digital. What are some of the top challenges that you see for engineering leaders when it comes to cloud technology? And for me, there's so many options. There's so much change. I mean, if you look at GCP where it is now compared to 2 years ago, it's really night and day.
Yep.
What are some of the challenges, and what are some pieces of advice that you have for some of the leaders?
I would say if I had to give one piece of advice, it would be to embrace the cloud native model. Sometimes we need to do just lift and shift, take something from on-prem, get it into the cloud. And that's totally understandable. If your release is coming up, you don't want to lease hardware, or you're moving off-prem, you've been co-locating, and you've got to get out of there, then doing a lift and shift makes a lot of sense. But the long-term value to the cloud is going to come when we start adopting things like serverless. I can't emphasize enough that unless somehow managing a cluster of virtual machines give you some kind of competitive advantage or makes you more agile, then there's no reason to do that. And that can take a lot of engineering resources that could be better dedicated elsewhere, like make your products better, do something better for your customer. And that again is one of the reasons, that's probably the biggest reason I've stuck with GCP. It's easy to run things in GCP. It's very low. I feel like it's very low on the ops side of the DevOps kind of world. So I would definitely, if you're new to serverless, I would highly recommend Richard Rose's book. He's from Google, wrote a book on hands-on serverless with Google Cloud. And it's a great start. It walks you through a number of different serverless technologies and how to get started with them. So yeah, for sure.
That's great. And you spoke to GCP a bit, so I want to double click on that. As you've gotten more familiar, and you've been doing GCP now a few years, how has it evolved? And then what do you consider to be the strengths, or maybe some areas that folks aren't as aware of?
Well, I would say in terms of the strengths, the amount of operational overhead required has significantly decreased. It's really easy. Even something simple like running VMs, having Cloud Shell and having the SDK already installed. It's very easy to do like quick little things quickly. There's not a lot of overhead. I would say the big advantages comes from the advances in the serverless. I mean, BigQuery's been around for a while, but I think people are realizing you don't have to manage a big Postgres cluster yourself, or a big large Postgres server yourself. BigQuery is a much better option. I think people are going to start looking to Cloud Run, and at least with their stateless containerized apps. Again, it lowers the barriers to entry. Being able to develop quickly, if you have a CI, a continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline, if you can just push that out to Cloud Run and you don't have to think about servers or even like a Kubernetes cluster, it just leaves so much more time to focus on your end product, the thing you're finally delivering. So I'd say that's the big advantage is there's so much I don't have to think about.
And the benefit to the business is your engineers are working on your core application. What creates a competitive advantage for you.
Right. Yep. And oftentimes,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, and the thing that kind of keeps me up at night is I'm not using enough of like the serverless servers. So there's some startup somewhere who is like, that's what I worry about. That I'm not taking enough advantage of what Google Cloud has to offer. And I feel like that's a risk. Like that's a big threat to me, because I know there's somebody else out there who is.
And what you're speaking to right now is, what I look at as well is really the core value proposition of the cloud in general. Hey, it's really an innovation play. It's not
Yeah.
necessarily an efficiency play, because if you have this small, nimble startup, they could potentially do with 50 engineers what you're doing with 1,000.
Right, right, exactly. And if you can take advantage of things like BigQuery, Bigtable, you have Cloud Pub Sub. I mean, these things that are global scale services that you do not have to scale up, you do not have to manage. That's a huge benefit. Like 10 years ago, it would be unthinkable. Like that would be just a huge advantage if you were able to do that. And the fact now it's like everybody has access to it.
So you mentioned Bigtable, BigQuery. BigQuery in particular, I think, is a product that a lot of folks are getting started with when they're new to GCP. For us, I think it's one of our best products. That's kind of the least marketed,
Yeah,
and we're looking to change that.
Mhm.
For you, of the products that you have experience with, you know, any favorites, one or any that stand out?
Well, BigQuery always has been a favorite for a long time, just because I spent many years in data warehousing, and I've wrestled with a lot of different versions of Oracle and trying to get Oracle to scale, and worked a lot with Postgres. And again, kind of going back to the where's the competitive advantage? Getting partitioning to work is not, it doesn't make my product better. It doesn't give me better insights. And so if I can, work with BigQuery, and BigQuery already handles partitioning, clustering, things like that, and I'm just running, just generating SQL, that's when I'm getting value. So yeah, I'm definitely a fan of BigQuery. I think Cloud Pub Sub is just a fantastic service because it's globally scalable, and it's a key ingredient to building distributed systems and allowing systems to be async and scale independently, like front ends from back ends. Yeah, I think that's a critical tool that I think more people will be using as they sort of adopt the cloud native design model.
Oh, that's great. So one question I have you, and I think it's interesting, given that you're writing a lot of these study guides, is last 2 years, the Google Certified Professional Cloud Architect has been the top paying certification kind of across the board. Um, this year, 2020, Forbes had it at $175, $761. Number two was the AWS Certified Solutions Architect at $149, $446.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think Google is extending that lead in terms of highest paying certification?
I think there's probably a couple of factors. I think the big thing is, of course, the basic economics is there's so much more demand for the architects than there are architects available. And I think that speaks to what Google's done over the years, which is, at first Google Cloud really focused on building the platform, building the tools, really making like an exceptional cloud platform. And now there's a focus, maybe in the last year or so, or year or two, on shifting to now introducing that cloud to enterprises and helping enterprises get on to the cloud. So now all of a sudden enterprises have another option in addition to AWS and Azure. And it doesn't take long to figure out it's a great option for a lot of workloads and a lot of different so for a lot of companies. And so one of the first things you're going to want to do is bring an architect in. And so there aren't a lot of architects because being an architect in Google Cloud, at least being a certified architect, is pretty demanding. I've done a lot of different certification exams myself, and the Google exams are by far the hardest. So I think part of it is just to get that threshold, pass that sort of certification threshold is hard. So there aren't as many architects out there as there may be, saying, if Google had made the exams easier, you'd probably have more people. So I think part of it is, Google really makes sure that the people that pass that test, they really are competent and not just studying like certification guides like I write, right? I mean, you can read my book. That alone you're not going to pass that test. You need hands-on experience. You need to be, make mistakes. You need to break things. And so I think that's probably another factor. It's like this is Google's not mass producing architects by just giving out certificates.
That makes sense. So last question, Google Cloud related, I have for you is probably the most common question that I get. And I talk about the technology, the go-to-market, some of the things that folks are less familiar with. But one of the most common questions is why Google Cloud? Would love your perspective on that question.
I think it's because we, outside of Google, are starting to see the benefits of running workloads the way Google does. And years ago, like years ago, 5 years ago, people would say, well, you know, Google Cloud's great if you want to run things the way Google does. And it was true. And yes, and that's absolutely true. So if you want to set up a bunch of VMs or run your applications on bare metal, you know, right, go to AWS, go to Azure. Now people are realizing, this Kubernetes thing, this container orchestration, I see how valuable that is. And thinking in terms of like pipelines and workloads, so doing things with like cloud data flow. And so I think we're shifting, like a lot of us are shifting and seeing it's like, yeah, now we really do want to run our workloads the way Google wants to run. So I think that's like the biggest reason I would say. That plus, there are so many tools available, like with the BigQuery, that are very easy to use. And now the push on AI and ML, so services like the natural language processing, vision, video, all of a sudden, developers now have these platforms that they can use that makes it very easy to make an API call to annotate an image or extract, you know, key terms from a document. You don't have to be an NLP expert or an ML expert to do that. It's as easy as calling a geolocation API and getting a map. Now you can do AI that way. So that's the other big factor.
I'd say that's one of the most common misconceptions that I hear is just the technology's not there for a lot of that stuff. And then they start trying it and they realize within the last year or two it is.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's good. It's, you know, anybody can stand up a service and say, I've got a natural language processing system. But you really have to test it to see how well it works. And you know, Google Cloud has been, or you know, the Google services have been built, and I'm sure they're used within Google. So these are not only, you know, being stood up and being reliable, but there's a lot of years of research backing them up. And so, you know, quality matters. And I think people will realize that.
Well, it's interesting. You spoke to, you know, building software like Google. A lot of people don't realize there's 11 applications right now with over 1 billion users. 9 of them are Google products.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, thinking in terms of scalability, distribution, high availability. I mean, all of us now have to think about that, like in terms of if you're a company and you want to start having more services, you want to go through like a digital transformation and start having a whole catalog of services. Now you have to think about, you know, how are you going to get low latency responses anywhere in the globe, and how are you going to be resilient to regional failures and things like that. And you know, these are problems that Google has solved well enough that, you know, Google can have 9 of the 11 billion user applications. And you know, how many of us? When was the last time any of us noticed a failure in Gmail or YouTube or Maps? So.
Yeah, and for me, that really speaks to kind of the growth that we've had over the last 2 years. So shifting the conversation a bit more personal,
Sure.
for the last part, maybe a bit more fun. Want to talk about just kind of your evolution as an engineering lead. What are some of the mistakes that you've made that are maybe top of mind?
Oh, that's a good one. It's hard because there's so many to choose from. I'd say, I think one of the ones I've probably done over and over again, it probably took me the longest to learn, is to not put the technology first. Like I was really enamored when I got started in my career with like Lisp and functional programming and AI. And it took me a while to understand, you know, that's great. That's really interesting. And it's interesting to me intellectually. That alone doesn't solve the problem. So being able to work with a client or a customer, understand what their problem is, and then use the tools that I like working with, you know, or maybe some tools that I don't like working with, but figuring out that it's not the technology that really matters. It's, you know, the problem has to come first, I think, was one thing. And the idea that build something really cool technology and people will come and use it. No, that never worked for me. And some of my biggest train wreck projects I've had that attitude. So I'd say that's probably my biggest lesson that I learned the hard way.
Thanks for sharing. I mean, I'm an analogy guy, and I always think too, you know, in basketball, you get the little kids who want to dunk and shoot 3-pointers.
Yeah.
They got to learn the fundamentals first, and they need to
Yep.
learn, you know, what is the goal of the game.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So, what advice do you have? I think it's obviously an interesting time right now, but folks that are coming out of school and get started, looking for their first job, what advice do you have for someone?
Um, I would say it's important to pick some field that you are like passionate enough that you would want to learn it deeply, and that could be anything. It could be networking, security, Java programming, data science. Pick one, but also learn other things. Other sort of tangential field. So if you're really into like high performance Java programming, make sure you also learn something about networking and maybe a little bit about security. So kind of think in terms of a T where you have breadth, but also really go in depth with at least one thing.
Okay, great. And last couple questions. What's something that folks might not know about outside of work?
Oh, let's see. Probably, I'm in a big gaming family. My children, I have 5 children, and we're now scattered across the U.S. My children are all adults, but yeah. So we've gotten very much into. Now we've been forced to use like Hangouts, so we do like virtual gaming sessions. And ironically, a big gaming that we've played for a couple of years now is Pandemic, and various versions on Pandemic. So we have a lot of fun with that. But yeah, no, my wife was also a coach. Also, one of my sons she and one of my sons is a game designer. So yeah, this is definitely a big gaming family around here.
That is awesome. And then if I'd like to learn more about resources to start studying GCP, some of the certification guides that you put out, where should I get started?
Definitely go to the Google website for the certifications, and yeah, just Google GCP certifications. You'll land on the page. For each of the exams, Google's done a really good job of outlining what is the material that's covered on the exam. There are practice tests, so you can get a feel for what the structure of the exam is like. I would say that. I would also say get on YouTube, because Google Cloud Next, the big annual conference, is a great resource, and all of the sessions at Google Cloud are recorded, so you can find really, really good deep dive, like hour sessions on various topics. So anything you want to learn about in GCP, there's probably some really good Cloud Next videos. And also, Google has developed courses that are now on Coursera. Google does a great job. The internal education certification team at Google is the best I've seen in terms of like the product they produce. And so there's definitely a lot of material out there. Yeah, so I would say definitely. Oh, and Quick Labs is a great kind of get hands-on. Oh, and also Google offers $300. Just sign up. You get a $300 credit, which is really, you can do a lot in GCP with $300. So I definitely say, if you want to take any of the exams, make sure you get some hands-on experience. And Google makes that easy to do that.
No, that's great advice. And obviously upcoming webinars, cloud on air, different things like that.
Yep.
Yeah. And anything else in terms of webinars or things like that are exciting coming up?
Yeah, I can't think of any like right off the top of my head, but yeah, I would.
Well, that's about all I had, Dan. I guess I want to leave the show. IGNW is a local DevOps and IT services group that is helping with digital transformation. They're doing something a little bit different and kind of neat right now with folks in companies experiencing different layoffs. If you've been laid off, they want to help. If you're an employer that needs project help, they're actually offering right now to connect folks at the cost of tax and benefits, and really help us get things back to normal, one person at a time. So whether you're a company and you have an open role, or you're a person that's looking for new work, recommend you get in touch with them. I'm wearing my IGNW shirt, which I don't know if you can see, but just want to highlight them at the end. Hey, Dan, thanks again for joining. I had fun talking to you.
Yeah.
I appreciate
Thanks,
you making
Ryan.